I forgot to start the recording again, but we were talking about the Open API module, and Ted was filling us in on what the status of that is and the goal, etc.
Yeah, so I just got co-maintainership of it, and so I'm moving, or I just moved all the logic from the water wheel module that was related to the Open API generation of the JSON file, and also the Swagger UI docs portion of it, which is like a submodule for open. Like a Open API docs submodule. So I'm not sure if that will remain in the module, but definitely the plan is to be able to produce, first off, for REST resources, the JSON that does the Open API spec, and then probably maybe via submodule JSON API, JSON API resources. And from what I understand, talking to Matteo recently, is that the schemata module already produces the JSON schema for for the data model, the resources. And that's
Right.
kind of, yeah. And so I took the code from the schemata module that was describing the that was basically just doing the straight type data conversion into JSON schema. So I copy that code over. Probably I want to look back and see if I can extract that back out. I just wanted to get the water wheel module out, and the schemata module was in transition at that point. But the idea was that it wouldn't live in the JSON, it wouldn't live in the Open API module forever. So maybe it's time to move that stuff back out. Yeah, so that's the goal of the module. So to describe REST resources and JSON API resources.
So at this point, the schemata module only describes the data model, the shape of the output of things and the shape of the input of things. That to take full advantage of the Open API spec, I feel that we should be also describing not just the shape of the data, but also the API interactions.
Yeah, that's what the Open API portion does.
All right. So, and that is being automated, right?
Yes, and I could share my screen and show the end
that's fantastic.
Result of it. Let's see here. Actually, I need to do this in. So actually, this is probably not the most up to date, but the water wheel module has a. Let's see here, Swagger. Water wheel. The water wheel GitHub, the water wheel JavaScript library has a raw water wheel Swift, water wheel JS. It has a generic output from what the water wheel module used to produce as far as Open API stuff. And that will eventually, or that is basically what the Open API module also produces. So let me just get that file up. And that's not the place for it. I know I've linked to it before, but I don't see the actual. Water wheel library.
Ted, if you if you don't think it's ready, maybe we can just leave it for another occasion. Don't stress too much. I mean, I'm okay with waiting, but I don't want you to stress or whatever.
Yeah. So basically, what it is the Open API module will produce the Open API spec, and part of that spec, say for each resource, say for the post resource for nodes, it's going to point to a particular part of the file that says this is the definition of what I'm going to return. And so there's a separate definition section of the Open API file, and that part where it says this is what the node will return, this is the node, or actually what it expects in the post case, is the JSON schema itself. So the JSON schema that schemata would produce is like a subpart of the Open API file. And I think potentially it doesn't actually have to be inside the Open API file. It could just point to it. So the real part of what the Open API module does is actually produce that, produce everything besides the JSON schema, and then either embeds what it does now, but maybe in the future just references another file. So that's what I would hope to do also for the JSON API, is that rely on the schemata module to actually produce the JSON schema. But then hey, Sahel, could you mute? Oh, and it's gone. Didn't mean to kick him off. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I'm not super familiar with the Open API format or spec, but if it's anything like the JSON schema, and I think it is super simple to reference other files, even if they are not in the same machine. So it could be fine, I think, to have Open API just not even be aware of the JSON schema and just reference some pre-cooked Drupal routes that are exposed through schemata. So
yeah, actually, so I have the if you want, I now have the JSON schema or the Open API generated file that I could point to.
Perfect.
Okay, let me screen share here. So this is entire screen. I want screen 2. All right, I see my screen.
I do, yes.
Okay.
Maybe you can click present to everyone, so the screen doesn't jump to my face.
Where do I do that?
Maybe you can't. Well, I will mute, so it doesn't jump to me.
Okay. So, so basically what we have here is this is a link. I'll put the link in. This is an example file that's included in the WaterWheel module. So this is a file that was produced by WaterWheel, but would be produced by the Open API module going forward. So it has these paths. So you have your Swagger 2.0, some information about it. But the important part here is, okay, say we have our paths here, and this is the node get path. And if we look at the response, the 200 response, successful operation, it references this schema, or has a schema that it references definitions node. And this is presumably where it could actually reference something outside of the document. But right now, I think the # is saying, reference something inside this document. So if we look at our definitions section, we have node. So this is basically, it's saying, okay, you're going to the node get is going to return back this node object, or an object that that follows this pattern. So we have the node properties here, and so we have the details for UID is going to have these subproperties of value. It's going to be required. Then the problem with this in describing Drupal resources is the fact that you're never getting back a node. You're getting back a node of a particular bundle. So I also include like node article, and node article would do this thing where it's saying all of the definition of node and then basically plus all the properties that we're adding here. Because of course, body field is not necessarily going to be on all nodes. So if your body field, comment field, field image here. So these are things that would be specific to the node article. So this is sort of like an inheritance that the OpenAPI spec uses. And one other thing.
Right, so I can see that the OpenAPI document is purely JSON schema syntax.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So this part here, this node article and node, this is what the code from the schemata module is getting us. Everything else in the document is produced by, like the path section is actually produced by the OpenAPI module itself. And then it just calls out to the normalizer of the, what will be from the schemata module and says, hey, you know, make the schema for node or node article. There's another thing that the OpenAPI module does right now is instead of, because one of the tricky parts is you have to say, well, it returns back a node, which is never true or never absolutely true, or it doesn't tell the whole story for a particular response from Drupal because it's always going to return back an article. So the OpenAPI module has a parameter that you can send in to the request to make this OpenAPI doc to say, I'm actually looking for what it would be for an article. And then it just would change this response from node instead of from pointing to the definition node to pointing to the definition node article. And this is basically, that's really useful for making the docs in Swagger API or Swagger UI, because if you want to actually have docs that mean anything, you need to say, hey, when you're asking for, when you're posting an article, you actually need to be aware of these extra fields that aren't on the entity type node, but really belong to the bundle. So that's it.
Cool. That's really useful, and that the limitation with the bundles thing is why we opted in the JSON API module to not have resources for generic entities, but only for bundles.
So yeah, this wouldn't be a concern then when we make the OpenAPI for JSON API.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of questions. Is there any way that you're detecting, for instance, that for a post operation, when you're describing the allowed payload for a post operation, you shouldn't be posting, for instance, node ID, or you're not allowed to post created date and things like that?
Yeah, there was a that was something I'm working on. So basically, there's a core issue dealing with differentiating required fields that are read only versus required fields that are required on post. Well, so node ID is required when you do the get. It's always going to be there, but obviously you can't post it. So yeah, there was something, I forget what they were. There's some sort of way that core specifies read-only fields that's not correct at this point, that I think there's a core issue out there for. And that's what I was running into the problem.
Right. I think that the main issue is that read-only doesn't cut it. It doesn't tell the whole story, because for a put operation, you absolutely need a node ID.
Yeah.
For a post, you are forbidden to use the node ID. So I don't think that type data or the field API is descriptive enough as of yet to derive all this information. So And that will obviously translate on the schemas that we can generate, or the open API definitions that we can generate, right?
Yeah, so I think there is something in Open API that would describe that situation. It's just a matter of probably, in the Open API spec, I think there's something that would describe what you're talking about, where you need it on put, but not on post. That was your, for the ID, that's what you're just.
Yeah, well,
I think
my point actually was more on the side of Drupal, that Drupal doesn't, I mean, we know it because we know how it works, but it is not specified or accessible programmatically.
Yeah, so I think that would have to be the responsibility of the Open API module itself to translate that. So until core gets a way to sort of describe that, then it seems like Open API module should have to describe that, or should have to sort of infer it and then make the Open API spec accordingly. So obviously for stuff like entity ID, we can figure that out. So every entity type's going to have an entity ID, and we can figure out that that's when that should be
right.
On
the same happens for user ID.
Yeah, and for created, I think because there is a specific, if I remember right, there is a specific created type of field. It's not just a timestamp, but it's a specific type data that says it's a created type. We could also infer it from that. I'm not sure if there's other types of fields that you actually can't say, well, that we just know because of the name of the field. I hope not, but I think like the node created field is actually of the type created, not just of the type timestamp. So we could figure it out from that point, like, okay, you can't update the created on any entity type.
And that's interesting, because then we could go to the created type and add the metadata that we want for this to be discovered or derived, because it is, as you say, it is fine to make a special case of the entity ID, right? Because it has a special meaning in REST. But when we navigate to regular fields, then I don't think that OpenAPI can do that beyond what core provides, right? I mean, the field type the core provides. Other than that, if you have a contrib that provides one of these field types, then you would be on your own.
Yeah, but I think if you provide a created, that is, I think, a special case, because if you don't want it to be the time it was created, you should use a regular timestamp field and not created.
Yeah, no, totally. But I don't know. I feel like there may be other fields that also shouldn't be allowed to post in other situations that we're missing just because we never had the use case, and those field type definitions, they should be able to say, hey, so when you're updating, you need to provide this, but the first time that we are going to create the field for this, I'm going to handle it. So don't post anything into this.
Yeah, so I forget if there's a way to add like third-party metadata to field definitions, but potentially if there was, then we could add the ones we know about in core. And so by the time it's actually making it, then we'd actually be reading information. We wouldn't be like hard coding particular fields. And then that would be an example for contrib to say, okay, this is how the Open API module did it. I also have fields that I want to add that way. I need to update the, wherever we figure out we can put that data, then it could be an example of the Open API doing it for the ones that are obvious.
Exactly, and that should also be a good approach to make a smooth transition for whatever gaps are in between what core is now and what core will be whenever this is perfect for OpenAPI, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I like that approach, and also it kind of lets us or you iterate quicker in this
Yeah.
particular scenario. Yeah.
Yeah, because if core is supposed to be open API first, then it really needs to have that information
Absolutely.
of, this is a field that is not actually or define what that read-only status really means.
And we are favoring here. I mean, we should acknowledge that in here that we are favoring REST as API, as the way that Drupal is API first, because the approach for GraphQL may be reusable, but not exactly the same because it doesn't have the same principles. Like the mutators, I don't think they work exactly as post, put, and patch. So
yeah, I'm not sure OpenAPI can describe GraphQL, or I guess we could look and see if, because presumably GraphQL is the standard and OpenAPI is the standard. So
right, no, I was thinking more on the when we define the field metadata that we want to include, so that it serves REST and GraphQL as well.
Yeah.
So if they want to do anything similar, they can.
Yeah. So one other actually question I had regarding JSON API is, are you still seeing my screen?
Yes.
So this part is a work in progress, but basically I'm trying to say, these are the things that are expected in the query string. So obviously format is something that REST expects. And it's telling you here, like, okay, JSON, and oh, that's interesting. This probably is a leftover. But anyways, this should probably be JSON and HAL JSON, saying, for this node / whatever here, node / node ID, you have to send format in, and it has to be one of the two formats we know about. Just forget that it says API JSON there. I don't think that's what it's going to be. And it's a required field. But once we get around to describing JSON API fields or resources, then there potentially would be, for every particular field that there is, you can actually put a filter in there, right? In the query string?
Yeah.
So would you think in the parameter section we'd actually have would be expanded a ton with every possible field that is in there?
I don't think so, because it's not just that you add directly to the query string parameter the name of the field, but you add like the consumer kind of chooses a name for the filter. It's a machine name for the filter, and that is not predictable. And then they can add things to the filter, like it uses the greater than operator, or it's in between these two values, and all that is kind of under the umbrella of this machine name for the filter, and we cannot anticipate that in.
But they're specifying it in code somewhere, right?
I mean, the machine name can be whatever. It's just used to group all the information about the filter, like the operator and the values that you compare with. And if you are, using, if you're using a multi-value operator like in, you need to provide multiple data. So it's just a grouping, a grouping key.
But I guess my point is, you have these advanced filters in JSON API that relate to the fields but aren't necessarily field names. But the OpenAPI module somehow has to translate that into actually filtering the fields, right? So the OpenAPI module would know what potential properties go in these parameters, right?
That's what I'm saying. That's the consumer that chooses the name that they like. There is no restriction in the name. So,
but to make an accurate, description of these resources, we'd have to go in to look at the consumer and say, okay, what names are they using? and then add it to the parameters here.
Yeah, yeah. That would be something that they would need to do if they want to specify every possible filter. But every filter is kind of under the filter query string parameter. And
there is an individual filter one, then there's sub ones. All the other ones are sub of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, it would be, there would be sensible changes when we want to adapt the Open API to support JSON API. I don't think it's going to be an easy step. Just like the work that I had to do for the schemata module to also support JSON API. It's kind of a different paradigm in the sense that it lives in under different routes. It doesn't have the underscore format parameter and things like that. So they are like a lot of similarities, but also not everything. Also, there are like, instead of having just 2 different routes in the for every resource, there are 4, and well, I mean, yeah.
So, well, I guess the larger question is, one of the reasons we were interested in doing this for REST is because it presumably gives you the ability to make very easy documentation for your REST resources, because you can either use the Swagger UI submodule, or you can use the Swagger editor, or probably other tools that know about OpenAPI. So I'm assuming that's one of the advantages of using it for JSON API. But if you're thinking of doing documentation a different way, then maybe it's not as important.
I mean, it would be amazing to have it. I'm just thinking that maybe not for the first iteration of the module, because otherwise
Open API module.
Yeah, because otherwise the complexity skyrockets.
I think first we want to get it out with, because I think REST is pretty close at this point.
Right.
So try to get it out with REST only first, and then start working on a submodule or related module that is, Open API for JSON API.
So I've been, I totally agree with that. I was about to change to another topic. I've been involved a little bit, and I will have to leave soon. But I just wanted to mention that I've been a little bit involved with the recent rewrite of the schemata module, so we can support different formats more easily. And I think that it should be ready now, or if you update the version of schemata, to just do a quick try, and instead of using found in that ref, use the Drupal host name, then /schemata, and then I guess that it would need to just fill the entity type and then the format. So the schemata uses the format of JSON schema because it outputs JSON schema, but it is dependent on the format that it's describing. So it introduces the underscore describes. So those should be the only things. So if you want to try that and let me know if that worked or not, then I could try to, at least we can advance in parallel.
Yeah. So whether I actually put the URL here or actually take what the schemata call the schemata normalizers directly and then just embed it. I mean, either way, it would be using the schemata code.
Exactly.
One advantage of actually embedding it here is you can then have a document or one file that you can send to, say, a decoupled developer and say, use this in all the tools that you know about, or that you're using that know about the Open API specification, as opposed to if you have to actually embed the definition here, then that requires sort of access to the Drupal site at all times. But it definitely could be an option in the module to say, reference them.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
So it could be an option like embed or reference external.
Yeah. Cool.
All right.
And also, just to put it in, I know it's under your radar, but to put it into the radar of anyone that's viewing this, there is a JSON module that allows you to visualize the schemas. So you can see the shape of the JSON objects that the REST serializers output, and the JSON and HAL JSON, and also the JSON API serializers. So it kind of shows in pretty boxes that are clickable a little bit what we were talking about here, but it's like the open API is the goal. JSON is the temporary band-aid.
And JSON is using the schemata serializers, right? Normalizers, right?
Yeah, exactly. Actually, it's a dependency of the module. Like
okay,
JSON depends on schemata.
Great.
So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Unfortunately, I have to drop here.
All right.
This was a great chat.
Yeah, good to talk to you. All right.
Cool.
Bye.
Talk to you soon.